From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The fallout from Donald Trump's presidential victory on Tuesday continues, and Democrats and their media allies are beginning to debate how they lost and why. What lessons are they drawing so far, and what lessons should they draw? Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here today with my colleagues Kyle Peterson and Barton Swaim, both of whom followed the election intensely over the last couple of years. First, a little summary for listeners of where we are with the House and Senate races that are still unsettled. Looks like Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania has a big enough lead that he should be able to sustain a victory over Bob Casey, the Democratic incumbent, though Casey still isn't conceding, so that could go on for a bit, but he looks like a winner. McCormick does. Sam Brown, meanwhile, the Republican challenger, has fallen behind incumbent Democrat Jackie Rosen in Nevada, though that race also remains close. The likely outcome there is 53 Republican seats, a comfortable enough majority for 2 years at least. The House control is still less certain, many races not settled, but Republicans have the lead, I think, in enough of them that if those hold, they will be able to retain their majority, albeit narrowly. We'll know more as the days unfold. So all of this would mean, at least for 2 years, Republicans would have complete control of the government, which is quite a turnaround. Meanwhile, let's get to our main business at hand today. Democrats are in shock and trying to pick through the rubble of what happened to them on Tuesday. Let's listen first to Kamala Harris as she conceded defeat, and then Joe Biden today talking about the result.
Do not despair. This is not a time to throw up our hands. This is a time to roll up our sleeves. This is a time to organize, to mobilize, and to stay engaged for the sake of freedom and justice and the future that we all know we can build together.
Setbacks are unavoidable, but giving up is unforgivable. We all get knocked down. But the measure of our character, as my dad would say, is how quickly we get back up. Remember, a defeat does not mean we are defeated. We lost this battle. The America of your dreams is calling for you to get back up. That's the story of America for over 240 years.
Well, Joe Biden in particular there, slightly combative in tone, urging his supporters on the White House Rose Garden there to pick themselves up and get back into the game, and Harris as well. What do you make of those messages, Barton?
Well, I listened to both, and of course they were full of platitudes, which I guess in some way is probably to be expected. You want to stay at 30,000 feet. What there wasn't was any indication that the Republicans had a good point, or Donald Trump had a valid message, or that the Democrats weren't listening properly to the electorate. There was just no sense of self-reflection, any hint of self-criticism except on sort of tactical grounds, an admission that they got knocked down.
Hard not to concede that point.
Talk about stating the obvious. Also, there was no sort of grace note in there, or maybe there was a hint or two in Harris's speech, but there was also, these jabs about questioning the election 4 years ago, which I guess is also to be expected. My main takeaway was there's just not a hint of self-criticism in either.
Notable to me, Kyle, in the Biden comments too. I mean, he was gracious in the sense that he has, invited Trump to lunch. He's saying he's conceded that he'd won and all of that. One thing he did do, though, was he suggested that somehow all of the good things he'd done hadn't really had a chance to reach fruition. These things take time, he said. And I think the Infrastructure Act, he didn't mention the Inflation Reduction Act, and all of its subsidies, but I think that's probably what he meant, which suggested that, sometimes you do these great things and the voters just don't see it.
The blame game is going to be epic. The Biden people are blaming Kamala Harris. The Kamala Harris people are blaming Biden. Everybody on the Democratic side seems to be blaming the voters and the electorate, saying things like you just recounted about how they just didn't understand the great changes that we had coming. It took too long. But I think the fundamentals were so against them, and inflation being a huge one. Again, going back to the exit poll, in the last year, has inflation caused you and your family a severe hardship? 22% of the exit poll, the electorate voters said yes. 53% said a moderate hardship. I think there is going to, maybe not among the people who are responsible, who are trying to save face, but among Democrats who are trying to figure out now what they need to do differently to win the next election. I think there's going to have to be some kind of reckoning with that.
Yeah, I think that we want to talk about that, because I think that explains a lot of why they are losing the average voter. But let's get into this, what I think is emerging as the behind-the-scenes brawl over who's at fault between Harris and Biden supporters. Maybe not the two of them overtly themselves, but the Biden crowd is blaming Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama for pushing him out of the race, implicitly thinking that, okay, I would have done better. Biden would have done better. The Harris folks are blaming Biden for putting in her a hole politically on inflation and his unpopularity, his low approval rating that she couldn't dig herself out of. And then a lot of other Democrats are blaming them both. Biden for running until he was forced out when they think he shouldn't have. Although, where the heck were they when Dean Phillips was speaking up, the Minnesota congressman sacrificing his career to tell the truth about why Biden shouldn't run and what might happen in the election? He came in and see us and said, I think Donald Trump's going to win if we don't substitute somebody else. And then the Democrats are also blaming Biden for choosing Harris as his running mate going back to 2020, because she was chosen for identity politics reasons and not because of her demonstrable political skills. They're also blaming Harris for not doing more to distance herself from Biden. Of course, that catastrophic comment on The View where she said, I couldn't think of a thing that I'd do differently than Biden. Well, who's right about all this? Or are they all right?
Well, with the exception of Biden claiming that he would have won, which I think is delusional. I think there's merits in all of those allegations. It was impossible to put lipstick on the pig of this economy with inflation. And certainly Harris wasn't up to the task. I don't know that anybody would have been up to the task. I've always been of the view that this was always an election about the fundamentals, which were the economy, crime, the border, foreign chaos, and so on. And there was nothing anybody could do to change that. And so I think, if Democrats can argue with themselves about who did what wrong tactically if they want to, but the real issue that they've got to face is one about failed policies.
Well, I agree entirely with that, Barton. The problem is I haven't heard any of them, not one, across the entire spectrum of Democratic support, except maybe for Roy Teixeira, who I want to talk about, the Democratic political scientist, who is willing to say the Democrats made mistakes on policies, because Biden certainly isn't talking about it. He's defending everything he did. Harris didn't make any difference, didn't explain to the voters what Biden did wrong and what she would do differently. And of course, the Democrats in Congress are all complicit in Biden's first 2 years. So they don't want to say, we probably did spend too much money and that might have kicked off that inflation that reached 9% and actually caused average real wages across the entire Biden presidency to fall. Overall, that is. It did pick up in the last year, but not enough to make up for the decline earlier. They just don't want to admit that their ideas and policies didn't work.
Never too late to start.
One difficulty, though, is that I think they generally believe in the ideology that is behind what they're doing. They really believe that climate change is a crisis and that the U.S. needs to do some sort of swift transition to electric vehicles in the next 5 years. They really are concerned about inequality, and they want taxes to keep going up, especially on wealthier people. And so that is hard, because even though Biden, as the more centrist candidate, won the 2020 presidential primary on the Democratic side, Democratic elites, I think, are generally to the left of the median voter. But part of it, I think, is just what they want to fight these battles on, what their sales pitch is. Again, the people who are responsible for winning these elections are going to say, we lost Pennsylvania, a key swing state, and we have a Democratic governor in Pennsylvania with something like a 60% approval rating. What is he doing right? And if they do that, they'll find a guy who does not forefront his ideology. He talks about getting stuff done, fixing the interstate. They're not the kinds of things that preoccupy many of the Democratic elites.
All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll have more with Barton Swaim and Kyle Peterson on the Democratic debate of what went wrong when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with our Potomac Watch podcast with Barton Swaim and Kyle Peterson. The equality point you raised, I have to say, just drives me crazy, Kyle and Barton, because they say, okay, we care about income inequality. Well, all right, fine. What are you going to do about it? And their solution is raise taxes, easy money, government spending. Well, government spending triggers inflation, which has hurt the real incomes of the lower class and working class people. Trump won the voters under $100,000 of income. Democrats won voters over $100,000. Why? In part, I think it's economics. I can see cultural debates are part of it, but economics, if you hold assets, if you hold stocks, if you are a homeowner who has watched your home value go up by a third, you feel pretty good. You think my assets are okay, I feel wealthy. I'm going to go out and spend. I'm going to buy that new car. Their spending is sustaining the economy. But if you go get by on wages, you feel bad because you haven't done any better. And your daughter, who got out of school and is working and 3-4 years in, wants to buy a house, can't afford it because mortgages are too high, because the Fed needed to raise rates to counter the inflation. So they just are utterly unrealistic about what impact their policies have had.
It was amazing that the closest Kamala Harris came to addressing the cost question, the inflation question, was price gouging at grocery stores.
Right.
Unbelievable. Just unbelievable.
I mean, how do you think this is going to shake out, Kyle, this debate on Biden versus Harris? Or is it all going to just, ultimately it'll be left for historians to sort out, and both of them will kind of fade into the background in Democratic history as Democrats try to move forward. I guess that's probably what is likely to happen, and they'll move on now to say, all right, we have to take on Donald Trump. And I noticed that Gavin Newsom in California, the governor, has already said we are going to be the vanguard of the anti-Trump movement. I get why he'd want to do that, because he certainly doesn't want to tout his own record in California.
Yeah, I think that that's probably the closest to the truth, is that the historians will blame Biden for running at his age and the state that he was in, asking voters to keep him in office until age 86. They'll blame Harris for being an uninspiring candidate who refused in any substantive way to break from the incumbent president, whose approval rating was at 40% or below. And the Democratic Party will try to turn the page to something else. The interesting question is what that something else is going to look like. Will it be a more aggressive Gavin Newsom resistance style of Democratic Party, or will they try to do a bit of Clinton-esque triangulation, moving on to somebody more like Josh Shapiro, who is talking about getting the roads fixed? And maybe that will depend on how the next 2 or 3 years play out, how the Trump administration goes. If the Trump administration can do the deregulation and tax bills and so forth that really get inflation back under control and the economy roaring again and real wages going up.
Before we end this program, we cannot let the Democratic pundit class go without celebrating their contribution. They, I think, are really dumbstruck by what has happened, particularly since they basically have had to observe that the American people elected the man they call Hitler. Let's listen to Joe Scarborough, who is the commentator on Morning Joe on MSNBC. I think of Morning Joe as a psychologist's couch for Democrats in the Trump era. And he's advising Democrats on what they need to do after the election.
Democrats need to be mature. And they need to be honest. And they need to say, yes, there's misogyny. But it's not just misogyny from white men. Mm-hmm. It's misogyny from Hispanic men.
Right.
It's misogyny from black men. Things we've all been talking about, who do not want a woman leading them. Might be race issues with Hispanics. They don't want a black woman as president of the United States.
Well, Barton, misogyny, racism, inter-ethnic hatred, there you have it. That's what they think of the voters.
Yeah, I think if you're talking about the left's media class, I think they are far too invested in the idea that Trump is a dark force, an aspiring dictator and all the rest to do any kind of rethink. Even to modify their tone would be kind of a silent acknowledgement that all their threat to democracy talk over the last decade was wrong and maybe insincere. Okay, just as an indication of how little rethinking is happening among the people we're talking about, I came across a fascinating piece in the New York Times yesterday summing up the election and looking forward to the next 4 years. In that piece is this prediction. This is a reporter writing, a news reporter, not an opinion columnist, a news reporter. The relative stability on domestic and international affairs during the last 4 years is about to be gone, replaced by a volatile president who often operates without regard to national precedent. Now, what sort of hermetically sealed bubble do you have to live in to write those words? The relative stability on domestic and international affairs during the last 4 years? But I think partially that's a function of the audience of the Times and MSNBC and the Washington Post and the rest. Those audiences want to see stories about evil and menacing and scary Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. And these people like Joe Scarborough and others, they're not going to withhold that from them. There's an obvious danger. I'll just say this one last thing. There's an obvious danger here, as you alluded to earlier. Pardon the statement of the obvious, but Donald Trump just won. He won handily, and he beat the Democrats' chosen nominee by a not insignificant margin. He likely won the popular vote. Americans knew exactly who he was when they voted for him. I mean, there's no one on the planet with whom we are more familiar. Now, you can say they were duped and gulled into voting for Donald Trump, but that's just another way of saying Americans are stupid. And I just don't think that's really an effective premise to run a media organization on.
That will not catapult Democrats to a recovery politically if they follow that advice from our competitors at the Times.